Hello and welcome to Sacred Mindshift Circle. I'm your host, Dahlia Deborah Donalds. Today our guest is Guy P. Anderson, the intriguing author behind Tesla and the Cabbage Patch Kids. In this fascinating work, Guy weaves history, mystery, and a touch of bizarre, exploring what might link a legendary inventor to one of the most iconic toy phenomena of the 20th century. Whether you're a fan of Nikola Tesla, fascinated by his secret histories, or just love a mind-expanding ride, this conversation will stretch your imagination. Hello, welcome, Guy.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, Guy, tell me a little bit about your book, which is what we're going to be discussing today. I know a little bit about some of the history, the background, about the concept for what is the title of Cabbage Patch Kids, like the history of it. But tell me how you decided to write about this and how it ended up being related to Tesla.
Well, it's actually a book about Tartaria. That's the main subject matter, which is the biggest conspiracy of them all. The fact that they wiped out an entire empire that reigned for 1,000 years from our history books. But it was when I started researching Tartaria that I connected Nikola Tesla and then a repopulation program that took place called the Cabbage Patch Babies. So it started off as a rabbit hole and then went into a warren because there are so many things connected to it. And I didn't want to call the book Tartaria because not many people would know what that was unless they were already on board. So I wanted to use two things that people would recognize. Tesla, most people will think of the car, and the Cabbage Patch Kids, most people will think of the doll. So I thought it would bring more people into the fold, if you like.
So how did you begin the research? Was it like that you saw one of the little postcards from the late 1800s, or what inspired you to like dive down that rabbit hole?
Well, it was researching Tartaria that got me interested, and that was through an Australian podcaster. He was quite a well-known musician. It's called Max Egan, and during lockdown, he was talking about Tartaria, and I had a lot of time on my hands, and I'd been researching conspiracies and human cloning for a long time, and all of a sudden I've heard of this, this empire that I didn't know ever existed. And it was that then when I looked at how they had wiped out a civilization, we're talking millions of people, and then had to repopulate, that I discovered the postcards. And then I discovered the first actual narrated film star and movie director, Alice Guy. I discovered her, then the incubator babies, then the orphan trains, and it all started to piece together.
So can you tell us a little bit about Tartaria? Because maybe some people have never heard of this and they're unaware. Tell us, what kind of civilization was this? And what kind of technology did they have? And how do we see it today? How do we know about it today?
There's two answers to that question. The first one is most people know of the Tartarian Empire as the Mongolian Empire. But actually, it's a blanket term. Tartaria was just a region. It was really Russia, Asia, a lot of Eastern Europe, and spun into North America as well. So if you like, it was the northern hemisphere of the world. That was Tartaria. And in amongst it, there were lots of different civilizations, lots of groups of people, from Turks to Slavics, Native Americans, Aztecs, Syrians, and Mongols and Tartars. So really it's a collective term, but the correct way of describing the period of time, the era, if you like, is the millennial reign of Christ. That's what most people would refer it to. But Tartaria has become this blanket term, and we use it because it's important people understand that particular word. So I think we've all sort of stuck to it, really. But we're talking about really a period of time, not an actual race of people.
And what was that period of time or that era like from your exploration?
Well, it's the echo of Atlantis. So if we, now it's a little bit more mainstream that the pyramids, the Great Pyramid of Giza, was harnessing energy. It was a huge power station. Now, people like me and other so-called conspiracy theorists that have studied Egyptology know that it was a power station. We've known that for a very long time. So, this is a civilization really that the Tartarians that were using Atlantean technology to harness energy from the ether, and they were building using cymatics. So everything they built had a purpose, and usually it was to make the person inside feel good or the surrounding area using frequencies. So, for example, people would go to a cathedral, and the pipe organ inside the cathedral would operate on the frequency of 432 hertz, which is the same frequency as all living matter. So you would feel totally balanced in there, and if you had any issues health-wise, they would be rectified just from the frequency. And this is someone called Raymond. This is something Raymond Rife studied and actually brought out I suppose a cancer zapping machine that worked on frequency following the same technology. So it's a far higher civilization, far more advanced, far more in tune with the frequency and vibration of all living things of the earth. They lived and built in harmony, and that's obviously a far cry from what we do today. So they were more advanced in every way. I mean, they might not have had iPhones and kind of gadgets that we have, but they were better than that. They didn't need things like that. They lived, I suppose, very peacefully and with purpose. So really, I suppose you could say in a nutshell, this is Atlantis reinvented. They were using the same technology that went before them.
Eventually, what ended up happening to this civilization, and how did, let's say, modern day governments eventually try to eliminate their history?
Well, the people behind it were originally called the Phoenicians, but today we would refer to them as the Jesuits. And they wanted to remove the Tartarian civilization because they wanted control. They're obsessed with greed and power, and that isn't how the Tartarian civilization lived. So through a period of time, they infiltrated every single city, every single town in the world. They took over the buildings, started to take over businesses, a ruthless group of people that sort of commandeered and I suppose stole and repurposed buildings. Now, then you've got the people. So what happened was a series of civil wars took place from the late 1700s right up until the early 1900s. And these were specific. These were targeting certain groups of people and getting them to kill each other while the Jesuits sat back and watched. And that continued into, World War I and World War II. But the other thing they had to do was disrupt the energy lines, because a lot of people will know what ley lines are, but it's the whole earth is an electric grid, and everything was built on these electric grids, and where two lines would cross is typically where they built a substantial building using frequency. So they interrupted the grid, and I think they used direct energy weapons to do that. Now, if anybody's interested in sort of digging deeper into that, I would recommend looking at the New Madrid earthquake. I think it was 1812 that took place. The Mississippi ran backwards, metal objects flying through the air, wild animals trying to get into people's houses because they were frightened, tame animals, household pets, becoming aggressive and attacking their owners. Everything completely reversed. And that is not typical of an earthquake. That's geomagnetic. So if anyone wants a deeper dive into how they did this, and that would be the best place to look. But it happened everywhere. We had fires and floods, kind of what we're seeing now, really. all over the world. So civil wars, fires and floods did most of the damage. And what remained, they either demolished some buildings that they didn't want, or they repurposed the ones that they did. And they're mud flood buildings. So you'll see that often when you're walking past these buildings, there'll be windows peeping out from the pavement. And people will tell you that that's to let light into a basement. But if you go into the basement, you'll see the windows are full-sized. And it's just 3/4 of them are blocked up. And then there'll be another level underneath, maybe more sometimes. And again, the windows will still be there. So they dug out the buildings that they wanted, stopped them from working with the ether so they could receive energy, ultimately electricity. And they did that by taking these really highly polished copper dome roofs and covering them in horse urine, which corroded them a lot faster, speeded up the process of copperizing them, and they no longer functioned. So there were a series of events that caused the wipeout. But a lot of people that speak to me, that they're far more religious than I am. I respect religion, and I read the Bible, but I'm not someone that believes in organized religion in any way, shape, or form. Even Jesus said, praying is something you do in solitude. You don't go to a building to do it. You certainly don't have someone telling you all about it stood in an altar. But I do respect that for some people they need to do that, and for others, they never read the owner's manual, so they don't know. They're going somewhere listening to someone else telling them. But in religious circles, it was called, as I said earlier on, the millennial reign of Christ. And what we're in now is Satan's little season. So in 1776, New World Order began. And you can see that on the back of the American dollar bill. You've got the all-seeing eye above the pyramid, New World Order, 1776. And then again on the Statue of Liberty, which they bastardized. It didn't obviously originally look like that. And that was the beginning of the end, really. And then from there, we saw the Industrial Revolution, the beginning of banking, the stock exchange, the Lunacy Act, prisons open everywhere, orphanages open everywhere. And that really was the beginning of the end. But it was a slow build-up. Lots of things had happened before that took place. So apparently, Satan's little season lasts 250 years. Now, I've never seen any evidence to say that that's factual, but that's what I'm told. That's what I hear, which would suggest that it ends on the 4th of July next year. So that might be why they're heating things up right now. Things are starting because they're running out of time. They've got to get these 15-minute cities in. They've got to get the next 6G up and running. We desperately, clearly need another pandemic. So, I think they're going to ramp things up now. We're going to see over the next year or so, perhaps the outbreak of war, possibly another outbreak of a virus of sorts. And I think a little bit more pressure. The news is going to get more aggressive, and maybe a few more fires and floods, because I believe they're running out of time, and I also think they're getting a little bit frightened because we're kind of all getting to know who they are and what they're doing. So the game's kind of up now, I think.
Well, yeah, and it's fascinating that you mentioned. I'm going to backtrack a little bit because that was a lot to unload. But I never knew about the 1812 situation with the river flowing backwards. Yeah, I never heard of that one. I did always hear that all of these wars and basically all of the things that they tried to do later on were meant to destroy their infrastructure and the proof of that civilization. And as we are going into your book now, because this is where it comes into, as they started destroying everything, what I had heard, it was liquefaction. I don't know if that rings a bell, which was supposedly that whatever kind of energy weapons or whatever they had could create a situation where the ground kind of like, I guess it kind of like lost the firmness of it and became muddy. I'm not sure exactly how it worked. Do you know anything about that aspect of it?
Yeah, that's what we refer to as the mud floods. And that is the liquid, I can't say it now. it's to liquefy solid matter. So we're talking rocks, the very road that they're walking on, everything was liquefied. But so again, like I said earlier on, I think that was done by using direct energy weapons, and it's not the first time that this has happened. There's evidence of melted rock all over the world. I mean, America's probably a brilliant example of that. Badlands, and around the Grand Canyon. Clearly, there was a significant civilization there, and these buildings have been melted. So I think in a controlled way, using direct energy weapons, they've kind of been nuked. And that happened globally. I mean, we see evidence of that everywhere. So not the first time that that's been done. I think that history does repeat itself. So some of these older melted buildings and what we consider to be tree stumps, but actually the narrative is that it's a natural rock formation that just happens to look like a tree stump, or some of these anomalies where it looks like a giant or a very large animal within the rock formation, and we see it and we think, well, we can see a skull there, or we can see wings or a head, or it might be an elephant or whatever it is. There's one actually called Elephant Rock, and I think they liquefied absolutely everything. But again, I don't believe that that's the first time. I think that's the deluge, the Great Flood. That was the first time that certainly in our historical narrative, in our history, that we can read about. I mean, I think we've probably been here millions of years, and this has been going on and on and on. But from what we're told, as far back as our history goes, the deluge or the Great Flood, the story of Noah, it's probably the first time we heard of something like that happening that wiped out people. Then, of course, that could well have been when Atlantis was submerged. And then again, they did it around sort of late 1700s into the early 1800s, like the New Madrid quake. So I think they've been doing this a lot. I think it's the same people ultimately following the bloodline families all the way back to Marduk, Amun-Ra. And he did say, before he ran away, he did say that he was leaving everything to the Ra Khans, the children of Ra, the Ra childs. Now, everybody watching this will know what I mean when I say Ra childs, and all of their cousins, the various other families like the Rockefellers and so on, all controlled ultimately now from the Vatican through the Jesuits and Pepe Orsini, the Grey Pope, who's the head of the Jesuit order. So it's not the first time they've done this, and I don't believe it'll be the last time either.
Well, hopefully, if they try to reset it this time, everyone's awakening a little bit faster. So I don't know if they're going to be as successful as getting rid of all of the evidence and all of that. But now let's move into what is after the mud floods, after everything is wiped out. You see a lot of pictures in the 1800s. Everyone's trying to dig everything out. They're digging out some of these, these buildings, these houses. And, there's the amount of people that you see in some pictures in some areas are minimal. So it was understandable that something happened to the great majority of the people. Now, tell me a little bit, going into your book, even before the incubator babies, maybe a little bit, how do you think after all of this, the repopulation agenda started to unfold?
Well, the wiping out of people was quite a long drawn out affair. I mean, we're talking over 100 years, over 150 years, because it was all of the wars. Perhaps the largest would be World War I and World War II. They were very specific. Dresden, if you look at what happened to Dresden, that's perhaps the biggest atrocity of them all, including Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What the Allies did to Dresden is exactly what you would do to a Tartarian city. And then if you look at the East End of London, I mean, look at London itself, the bombing there that took place, it was all in the East End. They didn't take out Westminster, St. Paul's, Buckingham Palace. They took out an area that was desperately needed for redevelopment by some very wealthy people. People that lived there wouldn't move. So it happened to be the only place they flattened during the Second World War. So it's a very strategic thing. So you're talking about a 150-year period. But what's interesting is with the population is in 1776, the world population was 770 million people. 100 years later, it had expanded, it had doubled to 1.4 billion people. Now, that's not actually possible. You couldn't double within 100 years the population. And bearing in mind a lot of men, and I'm not being sexist, but typically it was men that went off to war, you know, and a lot of those were gone for a very long time. Obviously, a huge amount of them never came back. And so the argument that perhaps they reproduced or, you know, decided they wanted to try for a family before they went to war is quite unlikely, because again, even if every soldier that was able to did that, you still wouldn't double the population of the world. But the really funny thing is, between that same period, so we're talking by 1876, there were 1.4 billion people living on Earth. But during that same period of time, 3.3 billion people had died. That doesn't add up, does it? It doesn't matter how you look at that. How can 3.3 billion people die when the population was 770 million and rose to 1.4 billion? You've got to have almost 3 times the number of people die that you had living. You know, it just doesn't add up. So it's all been muddied. So they depopulated by using civil war and then ultimately World War. Lots of people died from that, but we had genocide, and famine as well, and then of course natural causes. So it was a very sort of a slow burn, if you like. And what they did was quite clever, because if you lost your husband in battle, that was a reason you could be committed to an asylum. So could wearing glasses, reading too much, being overly religious, falling off a horse, or every month having women's problems. They were all cause for you to be sent to an asylum under the Lunacy Act, which meant your children then became custody of the state. And that's where it starts to get a little bit sinister and quite confusing as well, to be honest with you. So you can see what they did. It's very planned.
Yeah, I think also in terms of in Europe, the whole idea that you also had a lot of people that were living together, like man and wife, but they didn't have a license, a marriage license. And I think this also qualified that when they wanted to, they could also take those children away as well. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, but that's quite a small number. And what would happen is that this is in particularly in England, that the pregnant woman would take the baby to somewhere called a baby farm and leave it there until she was married, or the circumstances had changed, or be sent away to actually deliver the baby, and then the baby would be taken away. And in England, the baby farms weren't the nicest of places. You thought you were paying each week for the upkeep of your newborn child, and they were, you know, most of them are there in secret. You know, so it didn't look like you'd done something out of wedlock. You would pay for its upkeep. And often when they went back to collect the baby, it could be months later, it could be a year later, the baby had normally gone. They'd either died, said they had died, or they'd been shipped off. And that they were sent all over the world. They were sent to America, they were sent to Australia. In Russia, where this was going on, they were sent to New York and then joined in with the orphan trains. And they were all mixed up as well with children that they stole from indigenous tribes and forced them, you know, I'm sure everybody knows this story, but, you know, forced them to speak English, ripped apart their history and their culture, and try to, I suppose, re-educate them how the British Empire ultimately wanted people to be. So it's several things in there, but baby farms is typically where those the children out of wedlock would end up. And people might want to have a look at Amelia Dyer. She's actually the most, I suppose, horrific, the biggest serial killer in the world is Amelia Dyer. The number of children that she killed in her process of shipping them around, not feeding them, killing the odd one here and there. I mean, we're up in the hundreds.
Yeah, I remember watching a documentary related to that. And then also, because I imagine some people might not even know what you're referring to when you say the orphan trains, but also shipping these children. Once upon a time, you can ship them with the postman. There was no one with these children. Can you tell us a little bit more about the orphan trains? I know in America how it worked, how a lot of the immigrants from Ireland, the children that were coming, they were sometimes like unaccompanied, a whole bunch of children just unaccompanied, and they were shipped out to the West into different households and all that. But give us a little bit more detail about it, because of course you would know.
Sure. So the orphan train movement is the biggest known movement of children that took place. But in Britain, they were doing it up until really relatively recently. They were sending kids from disadvantaged backgrounds or kids that have been in trouble, kids from orphanages to Australia. That went on for a very, very long time. They were the first people to inhabit Australia on a mass scale. So it wasn't convicts. Convicts weren't being sent to Australia. Not at all. That didn't happen. It was children. If you look at the buildings that were put together in Australia, or certainly the infrastructure that was put together, and the buildings that were repurposed and so on, that's not the work of convicts. But the orphan train movement, so I'll give you a perfect example. So my mother's father is born in Ukraine, or Crimea, as we should call it. So he's born there, and he and his siblings are sent to New York. And then from New York, they ended up in Philadelphia and to work on a farm. And that's what they did. So one minute he can't speak English. The next minute he's being raised to speak English. No paperwork changed hands. So turns up in New York on a ship, goes into an orphanage, and then along comes someone called Charles Loring Brace, whose PR man was P.T. Barnum, the greatest showman in the world. And through an organization called the Odd Fellows and another one called the Freemasons, they arranged for these children to be shipped across America. And on arrival, they would be asked to perform outside the local Masonic lodge. And then people would bid for the children. And the children thought they were going to be adopted. That very rarely happened. No paperwork changed hands. They were slave labor. A lot of them were sent to work down the mines as well. And this is globally or across the world, depending if you're sphere or flat. And that's where the term comes from, miners. That's why you'll see in early pictures of children mining that they are children, miners. And that's where it comes from. So really the Industrial Revolution was based upon child slave labor. But it was a huge exercise. I mean, you're talking in America, they would admit to 250,000 children being shipped around on trains, but actually you can double it. Estimates get it to closer to 500,000 children were moved and dumped and forced to have a new name, separated from their siblings. If they couldn't speak English, they had to, and some were beaten if they spoke with an accent. That was beaten out of them too.
Yeah, it's very fascinating to go back in time and research all of these things and realize all of these different atrocities that were going on, but to build this new society that we now know and we think is normal, but really started with this kind of very sinister agenda. So let's go back to also the buying of the children and the postcards and finding as many children as they did to supply to work in these I guess you would say factories and to go on to these families.
Yeah, so the postcards are fascinating, and if anyone wants to have a look, they're not called Cabbage Patch postcards or Cabbage Patch Kid postcards. You need to look up Meadow Babies Babylon babies or repopulation postcards. Now, in time, that search will work a lot better, and Cabbage Patch Babies postcards will bring up more and more. But at the moment, it's still relatively unheard of. People aren't joining the dots. So late 1800s, a series of postcards appear that depict children being born from cabbages and people coming to collect them. So a lot of the postcards will show someone actually handing the baby to somebody else, or a couple arriving by some sort of vehicle, looks a bit like a car, and being passed a baby. And then a film came out called The Cabbage Fairy by the French film director and actress called Alice Guy. And that shows a couple going to a farm or a market of sorts and purchasing a baby from the cabbage patch. Now, this is old Slavic folklore that babies come from cabbage patches. And that apparently is because they didn't want to discuss the reproduction process with children back then. We were a bit more prudish. I don't actually personally believe that. But what I think it was a mass cloning exercise, that they were reproducing, because these cards, when you type in reproduction postcards, you'll see there are several that actually show machines where they're putting seeds in the top and a baby comes out the bottom. There's a lot of Masonic symbology in these postcards as well. So you've got these postcards and you've got this film that come out at exactly the same time. And shortly after that, within a year, you have the incubator babies that you mentioned earlier on with Martin Cooney, who called himself Dr. Martin Cooney. So they repopulated using cloning. For anybody who's not on board with that, perhaps you might know the story of the Anunnaki, which is apparently how we were created as a slave race. But if you lean more towards the Bible, then just read Genesis again, and it'll explain how you clone someone by removing the rib. The story of Adam is quite a good leveler. And for anybody that believes that's a metaphor, bear in mind it might be a metaphor, but it's exactly how you would clone someone. So either they did it, or a very long time ago, they knew how to do it and were referring to it. So I think cloning's taken place. We know it's going on now. You've got CloneAid over there, who advertise the service. I've picked that company apart. In my new book, I've written a chapter on them. I've been looking into them for over 12 years. So it's a cloning program. They repopulated with kids, no history, no memory of anything. They're not going to recognize or remember any of these buildings when they see them. They don't know what the old world was like. And if you look at any early photographs or footage, perhaps is a bit better, you'll see the relationship with adults and children is quite alien. And I think that's because they weren't their children. And Alice Guy's films are a good example of that. If you watch how she handles the babies, it's like she's never seen one before, or like they have no perceived value. So certainly worth looking at that.
Yeah, and just in case for anyone who has no idea what incubator babies are, this was at the World's Fair. I know in New York, there were several World's Fair, but I think the one where the incubator babies were shown was in New York. And it was, yeah, it was very interesting because they were just there and they were hooked up to these machines. And imagining that that kind of technology even existed to have the babies on a kind of like, life support or whatever, even before, all of the electricity supposedly existed. But they had the children there and people were coming and they were observing them at the fair as if it was something spectacular and paying to come and see them. So afterwards, so in your opinion, you believe that in general, society as a whole, although it's not written about and it's not mentioned in books, understood that these children, or a lot of the children that were repopulating the earth, were being cloned. It was something like common knowledge.
No, not at all. No. These children were mixed in amongst the ones that came from baby farms and the orphan trains. They would go to an orphanage. Some people would adopt a baby. No, nobody knew that there was cloning going on apart from the people that were doing it. So no, this was very covert. But they follow, these people follow karmic law. They do believe in karmic retribution. This is the Jesuits I'm talking about, and the Freemasons and so on. By telling us what they're doing, so by showing us, I mean, if you look at some of the PR for those incubator babies at the World's Fairs, you will see that one of the adverts says we can speed up the growth of a baby into a matter of days, from something like 6 months to 3 days. They're showing you there, but people didn't get it. The incubators were allegedly based upon a poultry incubator from a zoo in Paris. And then it was tried in a maternity hospital in Paris. And then Martin Cooney, who had no medical qualifications whatsoever, went on tour with his own version of that around the world. And the film that I mentioned earlier on by Alice Guy, The Cabbage Fairy, she said that she was inspired to make that movie because she'd seen one of these incubator babies on display in a World's Fair. But her film came out a year before the first incubator went on display in a World's Fair. So there are holes all over that narrative, perhaps none more so than the fact that Martin Cooney wasn't a doctor. He was not registered anywhere at all, and was actually really a showman or a front man for something far more sinister going on, because you could buy those babies. So if you look at the narrative, at the time, New York said that they were overrun with homeless children and orphans and babies, overrun, and it was sort of almost an epidemic kind of situation on the streets of New York. They were calling them street urchins, ragamuffins, and apparently out of control. So at the same time you're overpopulated with children, why would you introduce some technology that helped those that wouldn't have made it survive, so you have even more children? It doesn't really stack up. And with regard to the World's Fairs, the children on display in, say, the Chicago World's Fair, for example, they were on loan from a hospital in New York. The children in the London World's Fair were on loan from a hospital in Paris. So they're shipping children that are close to death, that wouldn't have naturally made it and survived. They're shipping them all that way to go on display and then be sold at the end of it. You just got to try and get your head around that, because it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So it's a rushed narrative, I think. But to show us what they were doing to avoid karmic retribution, we had the movie, we had the postcards, and then when this stuff started to creep its ugly head, they brought out the doll in the 80s. And so they covered their ass, if you like. If they, when they meet their maker, they can say, well, we never lied to anybody. We told them what they were doing. They just thought it was fiction and didn't believe us. But the interesting thing is, with the story of the Cabbage Patch doll, Xavier Roberts wrote a kind of a story, if you like, a fairy tale about how he decided to create these things. And you couldn't buy one, you had to adopt them. He was very specific on that. Although the retailer took your money, it was adoption. Now, the backstory behind that is that he discovers a cabbage patch through a mountain. Or I think he goes through a waterfall, through a cave, and then the other side, rows of cabbages with babies in. And one baby says to him, please find us new parents. Please find us someone to adopt us, or we're going to have to go and work down the mine. So it's all there. And the weird thing with that doll is that if something goes wrong with it and you send it back to be repaired and they can't fix it, if it's not financially viable, it's beyond economic repair, they send you it back with a death certificate. So you can see it's all there for people to see in plain sight. But it's the poison apple analogy. If I sell you an apple and I tell you there's poison in it and I laugh while I'm telling you and you eat it and die, then you've committed suicide. But if I sell you the apple and I don't tell you, then I've killed you. Well, these people have told us. We just didn't believe them.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And, like children or teenagers might not know even what a Cabbage Patch is. Obviously, I'm 40 years old. I do remember. But yeah, and I recall stories from my mother that when this doll came out, the media also created a lot of hype around it.
Yeah.
You know, they're trying to show it. And there was a lot of hype around it. And there were people standing in lines around the corner to get this doll. And, you know, and those are the moments where you have to recognize specifically that they're trying to push this this toy. There's a meaning behind it. There's something else behind it. Now, tell me in your book how you relate Tesla to the Cabbage Patch Kids.
Okay, so Tesla is one of the rabbit holes within the Warren. So Nikola Tesla, I believe, if he existed, that is, because there isn't actually any living descendant around to tell us that he was a real person, and there's no video footage of him, but there is of Edison and Einstein who were around at the same time and spent time with him. I contacted the museum. They say they haven't got any footage of him either. They think he might have been camera shy. So there's this grey area around him being a backstory. And of course, Tesla is an anagram of steal. So as in thieving, you know, to theft, to steal something. So that's kind of a bit of a grey area for me personally. Did he really exist? But if he did, then he was reverse engineering or getting Tartarian technology back up and running, because the main effort for Tesla was to get energy transmitted by the ether across the world for free. He wanted everybody to have free energy, and to do that in the same way the pyramids did it, in the same way the copper domed buildings in Tartaria did it, to harness energy from the ether, and everyone then has free power forever. That's what he was working on. I mean, JP Morgan, his financial backer, thought that he was spending all of his time on wireless radio transmission, so Morgan could control the news that was broadcasted. But he was playing around with that, but actually all the money and time was going into working with wireless energy. And he says that the information that he received came from the ether itself. And it was sent into the ether by the Venetians, or he would have it in visions. He would black out for a moment and he would see everything in a vision. So he was getting the information from somewhere. We don't know where it is, because, you know, he came out with these two stories. But what we do know is his life was spent on kind of reintroducing or reverse engineering Tartarian technology, which beforehand would have been Atlantean technology. So he's a key figure in any research into Tartaria, because, you know, one of their biggest, I suppose, one of their biggest achievements, I guess you could say, was harnessing energy and then having it freely transmitted across the world using these geomagnetic lines. So to have achieved that was pretty impressive, and he did do it. You know, he did get it up and running. So Tesla is a key part of the Tartaria conspiracy, if you want to call it that, in the same way that the Cabbage Patch Kids are, because you've got this race of people that live with free energy, work with vibrational frequency, then they're wiped out, then they're repopulated, and then somebody starts playing around with their technology and getting it back up and running again. So you can see how those two things are key to the Tartaria conspiracy. And that's why I called the book that, because I could have just called it a book on Tartaria, but unless you already know what Tartaria is, you're not going to pick it up. But everybody knows what Tesla is, and most people will know of the Cabbage Patch Kids. So I thought it would just be a bit more available to a wider audience, I suppose, by calling it that.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you said that yes, because I know of Tesla as if he did exist, but yeah, I as far as like images of him, it's whatever. I've never actually gone down that rabbit hole. So whatever image they have of him, sometimes, you know, they put him as a young man and everything like this with dark hair, and he looks stereotypically of that age. But I did hear that as they say, that a lot of his work and a lot of his inventions were confiscated by Trump's grandfather. That's
Ah,
familiar, right? At the time traveling and the Baron and all of these kinds of that's another rabbit hole. But
yeah.
yeah, the idea is also I think you know, as far as frequency is concerned and how in the 1800s there is proof, like I think you mentioned before that they had devices that they use, or I could be mistaken, but I think that they had devices that could turn to certain frequencies to cure your body. And there was an awareness of frequency being able to heal people, at least in the very early part, before all of this knowledge was little by little eradicated. What is your opinion now after going down the rabbit holes, after knowing so much about Tartaria? What is your opinion about frequency and how it benefits us, and what do you see in the future for humankind related to all of this information?
Frequency is everything. Everything has a frequency, and everything vibrates at a frequency, and we can feel it. You can walk into a room, we've all done it, where you actually think you can cut the atmosphere with a knife, and I know it sounds a bit hippie, but someone's got a good vibe, they've got a positive vibe about them. We can feel energy. Now, when that energy is manipulated into the wrong frequency, which is basically most music that we hear today, it's on 440 hertz instead of 432. It doesn't have the same healing properties that it once had, because the frequency resonates. So you would go into a specific building to hear music, or to sing, or to hear bells at the correct frequency. So frequency is basically everything. That's everything we understand, everything we see and hear, and we know now it's being manipulated. Here, I don't know what it's like there, but we have 5G masts which are putting out the wrong frequency. They're causing people to be short of breath. All sorts of problems are happening from this. That they put one in a field with cattle, and calves are being born blind. So there's clear proof that the wrong frequency has a damaging effect on us, and we're getting it through Wi-Fi, through screens, and so on. So they've manipulated the frequency to cause us harm, and there's a lot of money in keeping people ill, and there's not much money to be made in healthy people. So it's very important that we're kept in this sort of low vibrational state, but also it affects our mental well-being too. And if we're subdued and we're not kind of feeling quite right, we might not have so much fight in us. We might not pay attention as much as we would have done. So that's the key behind the frequency. It's making us ill. It's making us angry. We're listening to the wrong music. Certain music's been put out there to make us angry and to make us hate each other. But I do think that's going to change. I do think now they're rushing things. I think it's going to collapse, and I think we're going to put it back together again. Tartaria is becoming too big now for them to keep avoiding, and Putin's already exposed it once a few years back. He did come out with it, and then it produced a map showing the whole of the empire. So I think if they keep poking that bear, and I understand, it's NATO that are causing the problems over there. If NATO keep prodding him, then hopefully he'll expose it a little bit more, and then it will be unstoppable. I think it will snowball. And once people wake up and realize that we didn't pay for energy, we went to churches and cathedrals to be healed, everything was done in balance, we lived in harmony, then I think they're going to be a little bit upset to hear that. And collectively, hopefully we can kick the people in control out and get things back to how they were. And I do think that's going to happen. Certainly in my lifetime, I think we're going to see it.
Yeah, I think it's definitely already on the way. I think a lot of people are just looking for this kind of information, and this is really the purpose of why I try to do these podcasts, and I write a lot of my blogs, is to bring information to people that might not have heard of it before, or that need more, how should I say, confirmation that this is really something that is going on. So last question I'm going to ask you, as far as life and realizing that there might be a lot of people around us or descendants of those people that were cloned around us, what do you think, from a soul level, what do you think about that, as far as that it's possible that, because I've heard people who are cloned, in theory, they don't have a soul. Obviously, they might have a spirit, because it's energy, something needs to keep them alive. But what do you think about that, after going down that rabbit hole and just thinking that they're descendants of people who are walking around us that are clones?
But if you think about it, there's two ways to answer that question. But the first one is, if you think about that for a moment, there isn't a huge jump in IVF and cloning. There's not a huge, the difference in technology isn't that vast. I mean, all we're talking about is an artificial womb, ultimately, a difference of the womb, but the technique's the same. So what we would therefore say is, perhaps everybody that's born through IVF doesn't have a soul. And if we consider the Bible, and I believe that it's been bastardized. Half the books are missing. The best book, the Book of Enoch, is the one people should be reading, and they don't bloody include it. But it's been completely destroyed. But let's just take the story of evolution. And I know people are going to say, let's talk about Lilith. But if to make it easy, if we look at Adam and Eve, and not Adam and Lilith, but if we look at Adam and Eve, then what we would say is, if he was created and wasn't born naturally, then he wouldn't have a soul. And then Eve is cloned from Adam's rib, so she doesn't have a soul either. So that would suggest that everybody that descended from Adam and Eve was soulless. So I think this is just something people decide. There's no fact on that. In fact, there is no fact that we have a soul. We have energy, and that's all it is. So this reference to a soul, we're talking about our energy, and they can't pinpoint, scientists can't pinpoint in our minds or our brain where thought comes from, where our ideas come from. They can't find that. What makes us us, they can't find. They can't locate what that is. I think it's the frequency or the energy around us. So first of all, the soul, I think, is labeling something that is our aura, our energy, who we are, what we like and what we don't like. Secondly, why wouldn't a clone have a soul? I mean, who really did decide that? Who started that? It's a strange one. So, to answer your other question, what about people that appear to be soulless, I suppose, is kind of where we're going. I think that what we're talking about there are two different people. One, people who don't seem to care, people who do horrific things. I think that that's a separate thing altogether. They're just unpleasant, damaged, broken, nefarious, whatever you want to call them. But with regard to people who wander around the planet being told what to do, following every order, they've got no inner dialogue, I think that they descend from clones, or perhaps their DNA is more clone based. And because memory is stored in our DNA, it's stored in, as we know, it's stored in water, it's stored within our DNA. So I think the people that are awake have a stronger connection. So it may be, for example, myself, I've been obsessed with conspiracy theories since a kid. I didn't believe anything I was told. I don't believe anything about anything that I hear on the news or read. I don't believe in start and cause of wars. I look for other narratives. So why do I do that? And I think that that's because my ancestry, if you like, has more pure in it. So I may well have, and I guess it would be my mother's father, who was from Crimea or Ukraine. I think he came from a Tartarian family. And so within my DNA, I have his memories. And I know something isn't right. I know we're being lied to. I know this isn't how we're supposed to live. I won't roll up my sleeve and take a medical intervention at all. I will not go to the doctors. I do not watch television. I won't vote. I don't participate. because it's all wrong. Whereas the man next door does all of those things. So I think that he has a stronger connection to cloning than I do. So it may well be that on my father's side, there's a clone somewhere, or that a few have been introduced along the way. But my memory still has the remnants of my ancestors' memory. My DNA has it within them. And these NPCs that we talk about that don't seem to kind of do anything really, they just exist. I think that they have a stronger genetic connection to pure cloning. So it may well be that if they trace their family tree back, both, you know, mother and father, all the way back, they get to the late 1700s, maybe early 1800s, can't find anything past there. The backstory will be the records were destroyed or burned or damaged in a flood. And that would be because there wasn't anything before that. Whereas someone like myself, I might be able to go back a few hundred years further than that. Even though, you know, maybe it might not be on both sides, but I should be able to go back a lot further than an NPC can. So I think that's what it is. I think the soul is just a strange concept, and I don't know why a clone wouldn't have one. If ultimately if you follow the story of Genesis, if you are religious and you believe that story that we all descended from clones, or you go for the Anunnaki, we all came from clones, or you believe we crawled out of the mud and slowly developed into some sort of ape, some bipedal kind of creation that then suddenly learned how to talk, and yeah, it's just barking mad. And incidentally, the story of the origin of species, the theory of evolution by Charles Darwin, was funded by the Vatican. So, you know, all paths lead to Rome. So that's a long-winded way of answering your question. The soul, I think, has got no relevance to it. And why can't something have a soul anyway?
Well, thank you so much. That was very insightful. And that's a good point, actually. That's a very good point. And it's interesting to look at it from that perspective of that. It could just be that the people who tend to be more awake have more memory in their DNA from those previous empires and those genetics. Well, thank you so much, Guy, for joining me today. And for those wanting to learn more about Guy, you can find the links in the podcast description below. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to sacredmindshift.com so you never miss another exciting event or discussion. And thank you so much. God bless. Thank you, Guy.
Thank you.